Star Wars The Old Republic, the game that tricked more people than some clickbait videos on YouTube. I wish the entire game looked like the trailers, but that would have been too time consuming and expensive to produce given the amount of content that this game has. I mean, if you consider these graphics cutting edge, I'd hate to see what you'd consider to be a good combat system. I've played this game for over 400 hours, going through the main story all the way to the Chains in the Dark expansion with a Jedi Knight character before creating other characters. And since I've been in a big Star Wars phase for a few months now, I'd suppose a review of one of my favorite Star Wars games would come sooner or later. Fun fact, I almost decided not to try this game because of the genre and combat system alone. I'm not a big fan of MMOs and I don't like combat systems that aren't fast-paced or exciting in some way. But I heard how good the writing was, and being a fan of good stories, I decided to give it a chance. Over 400 hours later, I'm glad to say that I enjoyed the game much more than I thought I would have. So, without further ado, let's begin with what I believe to be the main selling point of this game, the story. Star Wars The Old Republic was released before Lucasfilm made the decision to rebrand the expanded universe into Legends and render its contents non-canon. As a result, this game takes the older, more interesting continuity into account, giving the writers a lot more material to work with. One of, if not the greatest strengths of Star Wars The Old Republic is the writing. When certain aspects of a video game are poorly made, blame is usually directed towards the developers, but whether they are at fault can depend on the subject in question, assuming poor design decisions are not the only cause. For example, graphics can be limited by technology, gameplay with good ideas can be poorly executed, the presence of a large number of bugs can be due to rash development, but the quality of a story and the believability of a setting are entirely dependent on the skill of the writers. In other words, there is no excuse for poor writing in any video game or any piece of media in fact. Now, not every video game has to have a good story. Some games have simple stories that only exist to serve the gameplay, and others barely even feature a story at all because the developers focus entirely on gameplay. If you are making a video game and want to feature a story that demands the same attention as your gameplay, environment setting, audio, etc., you must make sure that the story is serviceable and doesn't contradict with anything else in the setting. In contrast to the filmmakers at Disney, the developers of Star Wars The Old Republic clearly understood this because even though this game has many shortcomings, the writing is evidently not one of them. When starting out, players are given 8 classes to choose from, 4 on the Republic side and 4 on the Imperial side. Then they are presented with a character creator, which is good enough in terms of options. Something that anyone will easily notice is that multiple species are locked behind a paywall, which was a very poor decision, though the fault may lie with the publisher. After creating a character, players, especially newcomers to the genre, are presented with a rather overwhelming GUI, which is thankfully fully customizable. It is worth noting that key bindings and GUI settings are not carried over from pre-existing characters to new characters, so you'd have to essentially copy-paste your settings. I think this is a big mistake because there should be no reason to not make these settings universal. The game also doesn't make these options obvious, so I had to look up a guide to even do this in the first place. After getting over the rather unintuitive GUI, players then move on to experience the main story of their selected class, which is referred to as a class story. The writers also made all the class stories take place at around the same time so that all 8 classes can exist in the same timeline, which is really nice. Most planets featured in the class story have additional missions such as side quests and repeatable heroic missions, but the best ones have to go to the planetary story arcs, which are the same for all characters in the same faction. So one version for Republic characters and another for Imperial characters. The ones that impressed me the most are found on Alderaan and Voss, but all of them are worth doing at least once. Oh, and all these, including the very minor side quests, are fully voiced, which is nice. After the class stories are done, the game allows players to take part in additional content, which is split into 2 formats as far as I'm aware. The first takes the form of chapters with separate variations for Republic and Empire characters, which include the Battle of Ilum and Jedi Under Siege among many others. The second takes the form of an original linear storyline that is split into 2 expansions. Unlike the class stories, these expansions do not allow multiple characters to exist in the same timeline because you fill the role of main character for all of them. This means that you can replay the same story from the Battle of Ilum to the Zakuul expansions to the upcoming Desperate Defiance, but every character creates a new timeline. This makes sense from a development perspective, but maybe it could have been handled a little better since the game is set in the expanded universe, which is known for its lack of contradictions when it comes to the overall timeline. The game's overall stories, though well written, may vary in quality depending on your idea of a good story, but even the worst of them are quite decent. Regardless of the quality of the writing, the best moments in this game have to be the numerous character interactions and decision making that you'll have to do in the main and side quests. Since this game is set in the Old Republic era, character outfits and personalities were a lot more varied, especially for the Jedi and Sith. Although most characters are not as deep as those in the Knights of the Old Republic games, they are still interesting and somewhat compelling on their own. Putting aside occasional insufferable companions for future dark side points, most of them are likable and have unique skills and talents that they bring to the crew, at least from a story perspective. As you progress, you obtain more companions that you can choose to accompany you on missions. They would usually ask to join you after you finish your main quest on a planet, and although I prefer to have them on board because I don't like missing out on content, an option to at least reject them or boot them off the ship later would be welcome since this is an RPG after all. For example, I was quite annoyed when playing as a bounty hunter because there was no option to reject Skagg when he said he would take my ship whether I wanted to or not. I was expecting an option to shoot him on the spot and was sorely disappointed until I remembered that I killed him in the future with my first character, so whatever. Oh right, you get to kill them in one of the later expansions, which is quite nice. Like I said, this game is an RPG and having the option to get rid of characters that are forced upon you is always welcome. I do have an issue with the varying quality in companions because depending on the class story, you can get very likable companions early on, or you can get stuck with bland or annoying companions till a much better one comes along late into the story. This creates a rather big issue where depending on the class that a player chooses, they may either be invested in the story from the beginning, or not care all that much, which is a shame because this game relies heavily on the writing to keep players invested. I think most people would agree that the best moments in this game happen during the character interactions, which usually take the form of conversations. When being in a conversation with another character, you are frequently given the BioWare patented Mass Effect dialogue wheel TM, and you have 3 options to choose from. In Mass Effect, the left side of the wheel would sometimes be used for purposes such as investigation, but in this game the left side may as well not exist, which makes me question the designer's decision to use a wheel for dialogue options. Maybe a simple list would look better. Sometimes the game lets you decide the fate of other characters. When this happens, you are usually given a light side option and a dark side option. In other words, you can usually spare or kill whoever you want as long as the game allows it. However, I don't like how the game doesn't really present you with equal reasons to spare or kill a character. For example, during my first playthrough, I played as a Jedi Knight from the beginning all the way to the Chains in the Dark expansion. I found myself choosing light side options a lot more during the class story because there were only a few times where dark side options were justified. In the chapters that followed the class story, I made comparatively more dark side choices because both options were often equally justified, which I think was a good change overall. I think it would be safe to say that most players usually gravitate towards light side or neutral options, giving dark side options less of a presence in most playthroughs. So giving players practical reasons to consider dark side options equally was a step in the right direction. This is especially true in later expansions where it would sometimes be more practical to kill a defenseless enemy or spare an insufferable ally. Sometimes you will be given an interesting dialogue option I'd like to call the funny. It's not always obvious when dialogue options will lead to funny moments, but when it happens it's usually entertaining, especially when it catches you off guard. That being said, cue the montage.
This should be interesting.
You want to give me all your weapons and abandon this facility.
You got a strange sense of humor. Hey, what are you idiots doing? Get back here!
Nobody forced you to destroy your equipment, Doctor. Goodbye.
As a prisoner, I demand that you... Wait! Come back!
Not only are you a hypocrite, but now you're begging for favors.
Don't turn your back on someone with a blaster, ladies.
Yeah. Hey, over here. See us? Like to talk to you. Look out!
Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm very busy.
If you'll excuse me, I'm going to shoot you in the head.
And after a year undercover, I've discovered the way. Lord Grathan has a son.
Maybe in another year you can find out his shoe size.
Advocate, be so kind as to remove this thing from my presence.
Look at the bright side, Tubby. Bouncing back is probably something you're good at.
This must be some kind of mistake! Ugh.
That you could steal our great works without challenge?
Is that how you talk to all of your visitors? No wonder you're all alone in here.
Thing is,
There's guards every 2 meters in there.
That's why I travel with a Jedi, Remy.
You're a meat shield, Doc. Nothing more. Don't break your arm patting yourself on the back.
Good. You're here.
Astute observation, Agent Shaw. It is a wonder the SIS could get by without your deductive reasoning.
You're a droid that's gotten too big for her own bolts. How's that for an astute observation?
5 minutes. Can we please go 5 minutes without you two at each other's throats?
Setting the clock. 3, 2, 1.
Why do I feel like you're encouraging more than helping?
You can have this incredible marvel of starship design at a 20% discount. 30%?
I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation.
Gravity, huh? Good one.
You killed good men at that recruitment center. Loyal soldiers. The best.
If they were any good at their jobs, they'd still be alive.
You've killed my son.
Tarnus was weak. I spared you future embarrassment.
Who told you I killed your father?
Everybody says so. The whole place knows you killed him. And now you have to die.
Well, I suppose the whole place can't be wrong.
Our next objective is to bring Corellia's beasts to heel. You will be the one to break them.
You want an animal handler? Find a circus.
He's much more resilient than anticipated.
I thought you said you were good at this.
I cannot break him! I feel your anger, Master.
A blind, deaf, comatose lobotomy patient could feel my anger!
Wake me when you figure it out.
It's over. Thanks for playing.
Yes, this could go on forever, but I'm not going to turn this into another hour-long video, so let's move on. Since you can experience the story with multiple characters, this game uses a rather interesting little thing called the legacy system, which binds your characters together under your account, and accessing it allows you to unlock many useful perks, such as a universal fast travel and increased EXP gain from missions and exploration. Some of these are quite expensive, so it's obvious that these are meant to be unlocked over a long period of time. The legacy also allows players to view useful things such as achievements and their character's reputation with certain groups, which is tied to daily and weekly missions. Some of these missions feature a surprisingly fun on-the-rails space mission format, while others play more like a usual side quest. Some of these require a lot of combat, which can get old the more you do these missions repeatedly. This is especially so if you're farming for cosmetic drops like prime parts in Warframe after finishing most of the main story. Unfortunately, combat in this game is one of the reasons why I said that the trailers are basically clickbait. Allow me to elaborate. Star Wars The Old Republic uses a tab targeting combat system, which isn't what I would call engaging. After all, you're just standing still most of the time and pressing the same buttons over and over again while keeping track of health bars and cooldowns. However, there is some depth to it, plus it is simple and easy to understand for newcomers to the genre. Over time, I've grown to accept it for what it is, so it no longer bothers me as much as it once did. Every class has its own abilities and resources, which makes each one feel somewhat different from each other. I won't really talk much about these because they are fine as it is. Even though this game tries its best to make your abilities and playstyle look like your most important asset in combat, that is not the case in practice. To complement your character, the game gives you companions which help you in combat, either by contributing to your damage output or by restoring your health. I mentioned earlier that most companions have unique skills and talents that they bring to the crew, at least from a story perspective. This is where things get more disappointing. Star Wars The Old Republic follows the golden triangle of character roles, that being DPS, tank and healer. Since players always have one companion with them, they would have 2 out of 3 roles covered, which would give them some weaknesses in theory. Back when the game first released, companions had set roles which could not be changed, which gave them more variety in gameplay. This also made it so that some classes wouldn't even get a healer until late into the story, which made players rely more on consumable health packs, especially if the roles didn't complement each other well. To presumably fix this issue, the developers changed it so that their companions would be able to fill in any role, and that anyone can switch the role of their companion at any time as long as they were out of combat. Now any class had a source of healing when they gained access to their first companion, making consumable health packs and lower level companions obsolete for the rest of the game. You see, the game has an influence system to allow you to basically level up your companions by showering them with gifts, just like people in real life. The higher a companion's influence level gets, the more powerful they are in combat, or so it seems. Since they can all fill the same role in combat anyway, I only level up my favorite companions and have the rest serve as fodder to level up my crew skills. From what I can tell, for solo players, companions would usually fill the role of healer, not only because they can do it automatically without having to click on teammates who may be in melee range of enemies, but also because they can distract enemies for a long time while keeping both the player and themselves alive. Since players always have a strong healer with them, every combat encounter becomes a DPS check for the enemies instead of the player. And when the companion is there to divide their attention, their damage output would sometimes be so low that neither the player nor their companion would be in any danger. In other words, enemies are only a threat if they can outdamage your companion's healing. When fighting multiple enemies, it's always better to focus them down one at a time to remove sources of damage as quickly as possible. By the time you reach the last enemy, they would no longer pose any threat to you, so defeating them simply requires you to chip away at their health bar. This gets really boring, especially for enemies with a ton of health, such as bosses. The threat level can be even lower in flashpoints, where if you're playing solo, you'll get a GSI combat support droid, or as the community calls it, the Jesus droid. This absolute unit can solo entire groups of enemies by itself because it is a DPS, tank and healer combined. It has carried me and many others through countless missions, which explains why everyone loves it. I only wish that a toned down version of it could become a permanent companion. So far, the only enemies that took me a long time to beat are key bosses such as Darth Malgus during the Battle of Ilum and Vaylin and Valkorion during Knights of the Eternal Throne, precisely because you lose access to your companions during these fights. I wasn't prepared for the game to just take them away, which forced me to rely on sources of healing provided by the level, which turned out to be just enough to sustain my character until the end of the fight. It's a shame that combat in this game is such a disappointment. Fighting enemies outside of optional mission objectives doesn't even give good rewards, so I just found myself avoiding them most of the time. Not taking the overpowered stealth mechanic into account, it is much easier to avoid enemies in large outdoor environments as opposed to indoor spaces because of the aggro range. Speaking of outdoor areas, this is a good place to transition into the environments featured in this game. Generally, the environments in this game look beautiful. The developers did very well with what they had, and since the game's graphics are unremarkable, they made up for it in art style. It is worth noting that they are still updating the environments to make the game look better, which is very commendable given the age of the game. As for design and playable space, the best planets that I've seen so far are the starting ones, which have the environment properly scaled to be just big enough for low-level characters to explore, especially since they don't have access to a mount yet. Later planets like Ossus, Darvanis, Rishi and Yavin 4 also do a good job of being just large enough for endgame players with high-speed mounts while preventing mission objectives from being spread out over large distances. In contrast, the barren landscapes of Tatooine and Hoth as well as the first instance of Nathema are mostly empty space designed to waste your time as you travel to your mission objective. Most of these areas don't even get used as there are huge empty pieces of land that the game doesn't give you a reason to travel to. For this reason, Tatooine and Hoth are a slog at best, and that's not even mentioning how painful they are to look at, specifically because the bright and featureless landscapes tend to strain the eyes. In terms of navigation, it's also a hit or miss. For example, Alderaan and Voss are well made and traveling between areas is convenient and intuitive. In contrast, Corellia is a nightmare because even though it takes the form of a city, the level itself is more like a bunch of huge open spaces connected by single roads at very specific points which can either be difficult to find or time-consuming to reach. When it comes to aesthetics, the natural environments are mostly great, but the man-made environments are way too large and look almost comical as a result, especially indoor rooms and hallways. A great example of this is the Senate building in Coruscant, which looks like someone just scaled up the entire model without much thought. This is a problem because many objectives were placed at the end of these indoor areas, which forces players to waste a considerable amount of time getting there, not to mention some enemies are placed specifically to prevent players from running past them. Some of these areas have interactables that allow you to return to the beginning, but not all of them, which is puzzling. I know that I've been quite critical of the game so far, but that's because this game is far from perfect. It's like the opposite of Doom, where you want to get the story bits over with so that you can continue shooting demons. Star Wars The Old Republic is a rare instance where I'm willing to look past these gameplay faults because I just want to continue the story. And that's okay. I didn't touch on co-op PvP or guild related activities in this video because I'm not inclined to engage with them, so it would be best to leave them out. I'd encourage you to try them out if you enjoy these social aspects of the genre, but I can see why many players have never bothered because of the nature of this game. So that's all of my review for Star Wars The Old Republic. I recommend this game to anyone who's a fan of the Star Wars genre and wants to immerse themselves in it. I would say that some level of tolerance for the game's shortcomings and the willingness to roleplay as a character in the game is required to enjoy it for what it is. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching, and may the Force serve you well.